August 4th, and rockets are flying toward the Crimean Bridge.
This is fucked, gentlemen. Hello? Unbelievable. The bridge has been blown up.
A new special operation by the SBU strikes on the bridge, the Black Sea Fleet, and Crimea's air defense. And something terrible has begun in Crimea. A new series of explosions on the peninsula. Tarkankut, Donuslav, Yevpatoria, Saki district, Bakhchisarai district, Kacha, Sevastopol. Explosions.
Just now, out of a total of 12 missiles that were actively heading toward the critical bridges, what you are seeing now displayed is the Chongar Bridge.
The security service of Ukraine is now launching a significant new phase of its special operation, actively attacking the strategically vital Crimean Bridge, various military facilities, key airfields, and numerous military bases. Consequently, widespread panic and a rapid evacuation have already begun in Crimea.
We've been standing here since 4:25 in the morning. Around 5 o'clock in the evening, or perhaps even closer to 6, they decisively turned us around and sent absolutely everyone home to get some much-needed rest.
We'll discuss all of this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitten right now. There it goes again, look.
An oil depot. An oil depot. That's it, gentlemen. We're screwed. Damn.
A new wave of explosions in Crimea. God, SBU, don't stop. Tarkankut, Donuslav, Yevpatoria, Saki district, Bakhchisarai district, Kacha, Sevastopol, explosions. Panic has started in Crimea. There's an evacuation in Crimea. The SBU has launched the second phase of the special operation, the Kerch Bridge and Russia's nuclear triad. Ukraine is attacking two parts of Russia's nuclear triad: the headquarters of the Northern Fleet, the nuclear submarines in Severomorsk, strategic nuclear bombers, and the Kerch Bridge.
The bridge has been damaged. That is, at least one of the bridge's supports has been damaged. If we look at the overall attack on Russian strategic targets, specifically strategic ones, because, for example, strikes on Russian strategic aviation aircraft are strategic targets, especially since there are 5 of them, as it turned out 5, just as we said. The thing is, they didn't count the one at Ukrainka. At least one confirmed 295 at Ukrainka was hit. So strategic aviation, and after that, the strategic bridge. The bridge truly has strategic significance because it connects the Russian Taman with our peninsula, Crimea. And if it is put out of commission, destroyed in principle until we liberate Crimea, or for example, until it becomes possible to approach with bombers and simply drop hundreds of aerial bombs on this bridge, it cannot be destroyed. There are certain factors that make it impossible to do this. The only options are engineering methods for its destruction, meaning blowing up all the pillars. That is, you would have to lay, there will be a lot of problems just to at least deactivate it from its active state. But simply damaging it, for example, at the present moment, as it was damaged at one time by the security service, both in 2022 and in 2023, putting it out of commission for a certain period, at least for half a year, for the duration of, say, a summer campaign, that is indeed possible. Moreover, a significant and strategic strike specifically targeting the Kerch Bridge is intrinsically tied to the very beginning, to the crucial start of our comprehensive liberation campaign to effectively deoccupy the entire Crimean Peninsula, a vital territory. Why? Because without a doubt, the bridge must first be destroyed or damaged or put out of commission. There can be different mechanisms for this. To put it out of commission so that the Russians cannot transfer a sufficient number of troops to Crimea. After that, with long-range strike capabilities using the same drones and missiles, since it's 200 to 300 kilometers to Crimea, we have almost everything that can fly that far. That is, this is the main range for our long-range operational level strike assets, which are also handled by the security service. Therefore, I think the next wave will be striking specifically at military targets in Crimea, of which there are at least 100 stationary ones currently operating and about 100 mobile ones. So the work of the special services lies ahead. There is a vast amount of so-called work to be done. But this, you could say, the strike on the Kerch Bridge is the beginning of this liberation campaign in Crimea.
Roman Grigorievich, regarding the nuclear triad, I heard comments from Keith Kellogg. He is simply stunned. He believes that this is simply a huge, colossal problem for Russia. This is called escalation. That Ukraine struck at the nuclear triad of the Russian Federation, at 2 components, right? This is the Northern Fleet of the Russian Federation, where the nuclear submarines are located. And of course, the strategic nuclear aviation. How much of a breakthrough is this? And the fact that you feel the strike on the Kerch Bridge is the second phase of the SBU special operation.
Well, that means there will be a third phase. If, for example, a Russian submarine gets hit, say, in the Northern Fleet or the Pacific Fleet, I wouldn't be surprised because they feel far too comfortable in the seas. And we've already struck both Russian ground positions and strategic positions, but there's still one component left, the so-called naval component. So, in the near future, most likely, if you remember, or rather if you didn't notice, the main intelligence directorate has gone quiet somewhere. They carried out an operation in Vladivostok against the Russian Pacific Fleet, and now they've gone silent somewhere, not ruling out the possibility that yet another Russian submarine might sink. And as always, Putin will say, well, what happened to the Kursk, to the submarine? It sank. What happened to the strategic aviation? It burned down. What happened to the Pacific Fleet? Well, it broke up into quarks. So this too might happen. Let's wait. There will probably be a third serious blow ahead. And this is the first one. You were right to point out the triad. You're highlighting it correctly. Why? Because the air component is one of the main components, and it was the first to be put into service. It is specifically the strategic bombers that are Russia's strategic nuclear weapons. Malyuk's strike showed that this component no longer dominates the world, that's for sure. Why? Because, well, a $500 drone, or simply a sufficient number of drones, can practically destroy Russia's strategic aviation. That's now possible. Everyone understands perfectly well that the era of drones has already begun. The era of drones. It feels like in the near future, planet Earth will turn into some kind of iron planet. No water, no vegetation, no natural resources, inhabited by robots. That is, it's inhabited by these kinds of drones. And in the end, this could, of course, potentially turn into a complete and utter apocalypse, just like the terrifying scenarios that were once vividly shown in many classic Hollywood movies. So this significant and pressing problem really does exist in all the various countries of the world that have heavily invested in robust strategic security mechanisms. I mean, what was the actual and ultimate point of investing literally tens of trillions of dollars over the past 100 years into something that, in the final analysis, a relatively inexpensive $500 drone can just completely take out in a mere matter of seconds, as Malyuk so clearly and demonstrably showed? That's why I would say that Malyuk and the security service of Ukraine have become the driving force at the start of a new era, a new milestone in security with different mechanisms. We really need to invest in robots. By robots, I mean, of course, drones. Drones that, with minimal funding, can accomplish major tasks. And basically, all these strategies will eventually be rendered obsolete. Once, if anyone remembers, Reagan, I think it was him, may he rest in peace, once said he had a great monologue. Where are those six-story fools, the dinosaurs? Where did they go extinct? But the little bedbug has been living and thriving for 30 billion or however many 3 billion years. So that's more or less what the next era will look like. It'll be something along those lines. In other words, the little bedbugs we're talking about now, meaning the small drones, they'll keep getting smaller and smaller, but without losing their combat effectiveness. And eventually, what will they become? To the point that Putin not so long ago actually predicted, together with Skabiva and all that Russian media riffraff. Ukrainian combat mosquitoes. You were all laughing just now, laughing about combat mosquitoes. Believe me, when billions of combat mosquitoes, Ukrainian mosquitoes, invade Russian Siberia, or say the Trans-Urals, let alone the Urals themselves, there won't be a single Russian left there. They'll be drawn to them following the scent. And the Russian spirit smells so strong, oh boy, no filter, not a single one can help there. You have to put on gas masks if there are Russian federal troops nearby. So naturally, following the scent, these Ukrainian combat mosquitoes will wipe out the entire Rus, the whole Russian herd, this entire Russian federalist herd that invaded Ukraine.
Roman Igorovich, regarding the Northern Fleet and the Pacific Fleet of Russia, how feasible is it to carry out a special operation there at all?
Well, it's definitely possible. As for the Northern Fleet, on the one hand, it's simply closer because it's just over 1,000 kilometers away, and we've already carried out missions there before. Olenia is not far from the base. Yes, so this direction is in principle possible even with long-range strike systems launched from our territory. And as for Vladivostok, in some ways, that's even easier. Have we ever discussed with you what Vladivostok actually is? Well, that's Zeleny Klin. That's the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic, which isn't populated by robots, but by Ukrainians. Ukrainians who genetically have been there for over 100 years. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians were brought there under certain programs, mostly from the Poltava and Chernihiv regions. Why is there an airfield called Chernigovka there? Well, that's something I know, for example, from the airfields. Chernigovka and also Ukrainka, these are our people from Poltava and residents of the Chernihiv region back in the day. Naturally, these historical roots still make themselves profoundly felt. And Vladivostok is actually one of the truly main jewels of this significant Zeleny Klin, our very own Ukrainian one, a vibrant and essential part of our heritage. Vladivostok, of course, getting there is a bit of a challenge. All the more so if, in the end, we recognize the government in exile of the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic, then it could even, for example, sign agreements with, say, Japan about returning those so-called disputed islands, which are actually Japanese islands. And Sakhalin is a Japanese island as well. So this issue really needs to be addressed there in parallel, of course, by putting pressure on the Pacific Fleet, because there are Ukrainians in the fleet too. Do you really think our midshipmen aren't there? They're practically every other one has our Ukrainian, that solid, deep-rooted family tree among the midshipmen. Because back in the day in the Soviet army, all the warrant officers were Ukrainians and all the midshipmen in the Navy were Ukrainians too. So believe me, if the survival of our nation is at stake, this so-called call of the ancestors will make it possible to sink almost the entire Pacific Fleet. And if we approach our relations with the Japanese and South Koreans correctly, they'll even help us because it's in their interest too.
Roman Grigorievich, when I spoke with a military analyst, they said that the Topol and Yars are part of the powerful nuclear arsenal of the Russian Federation. How important are these assets? And, for example, is destroying a Topol or Yars a realistic goal for the Ukrainian special services? Naturally.
Well, that's rather difficult, of course. The thing is, these are, after all, strategic forces, missile troops. So there's a certain selection process for service there. There are also some aspects related to polygraph testing. So there's very strict control over this particular component. And it would be very difficult, for example, to get close enough to destroy these missiles. The Russians will ruin them themselves. Well, knowing that they're all pretty clumsy, they'll end up ruining them on their own. The Topol is an excellent, excellent missile. It was first launched, I believe, back in the 1980s in the Soviet Union. And then the Russians refined it further to a more or less acceptable state. But the main basic, so to speak, fundamental starting conditions were, of course, established back in the Soviet Union. There was a strong tradition and a missile school there, especially after our Ukrainian practically put everything into the missile program. If you remember, that is while serving as General Secretary of the CPSU Central Committee, Khrushchev accomplished this task and Brezhnev refined it further. Again, both of them were Ukrainians. That's why the missile program was, of course, very well developed in the Soviet Union. The Russians picked up on some aspects, but because the Soviet Union collapsed and the components of the overall production cycle ended up scattered across different republics, things changed. By the way, the main ones were here with us, specifically in Ukraine, because we built the same SS-18, the same Satan missile. It was us who made it at Yuzmash. Naturally, the Topol missile is a successor in this kind of missile program. The Topol-M especially is a pretty good missile, and the one that comes after it is also, well, not exactly a clone, but basically the same missile, just with a different warhead and multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles. That's the Yars. So after the Topol, then the Yars, the RS-24, and then the RS-26. They built or tried to build the Oreshnik, also known as the Rubezh. That's the Rubezh. Putin called it the Oreshnik. And the next in the line, the fourth missile, is the RS-28, which is the Sarmat. But the Sarmat can't even get off the launch pad. Out of 7 launches, there were 6 explosions and several silos were completely destroyed. And most likely this whole series of missiles is finished. In other words, they won't really have the Sarmat and they'll keep fussing over the Oreshnik like a fool with a rattle. But once its propaganda value runs out, they'll forget about it too. But there are 2 missiles that are serious and problematic for us, and for the whole world, actually, the Topol and the Yars. They can travel more than 10,000 kilometers. These are intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads. The Topol has them, and the Yars has multiple independently targetable warheads, each with its own guidance system, about 6 warheads that are deployed. So this really is a serious problem. But it's probably not as much of a problem for us, because these are nuclear weapons, and the Russians aren't going to use nukes against us. And as for firing a conventional intercontinental ballistic missile at themselves, well, that's like using a microscope to hammer in nails. So it's not a problem for us, it's a problem for NATO generals and for the Chinese as well. In other words, these are long-range mechanisms of destruction. For us, the main problem is the Iskanders, the Iskander KN-23s and the Kinjal missiles, that is ballistic and aeroballistic missiles, which we need to neutralize. The optimal way to neutralize the use of these missiles is, of course, to destroy the Russian hydrocarbon industry because everything depends on it. They run on diesel, on gasoline, they fly on aviation kerosene. The hydrocarbon sector needs to be destroyed. Bankova has ensured the safety of the Russian hydrocarbon sector. That's why this problem exists, because it's very difficult to defend against a ballistic missile. We should have had our own a long time ago. It's already the 7th year, and by now we probably could have put these missiles into serious production, but so far we still haven't seen them. Well, we hope that in the end we'll get them, our ballistic missiles. But the real problem for us, of course, is the Russian Iskanders, because first we need to destroy all Russian oil refineries and everything related to fuel production. And second, of course, is air defense. That is, we need to increase the number of anti-ballistic systems like Patriot and SAMP-T. There are no other options. There is no third option.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Roman Grigorievich, you have always said that we need to turn our attention to the occupied Crimea. And now the security service of Ukraine has carried out a successful special operation. Then they blew up the bridges near Melitopol. Yes, these are very important logistical hubs that connect the occupied peninsula with the occupied south of Ukraine, and essentially they supply the enemy's groupings. How do you assess the situation now? Last night there were explosions, and during the day the explosions in Crimea continue. We are attacking military targets. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, they packed Crimea like sardines in a can with several million Russians from beyond the Urals who were promised something grand there. In other words, they increased the number of Russian livestock in Crimea. Naturally, they have also packed military facilities in there for almost 11, well, it's practically the 12th year now. Before that, the Russian Black Sea Fleet was based there. We allowed it, well, mostly our so-called great leaders who looked so far ahead that in the end, they lost Crimea in the first place, initially allowing its loss back in 2014. So a very large number of Russian civilian invaders, they are indeed civilian invaders, these individuals. None of the, well, they don't even know this, but absolutely no protections apply to them whatsoever. Any Russian citizen who is on the occupied territory of Ukraine is considered an invader, and none of the conventions that apply to civilians apply to them. That is, naturally for us, they are the same invaders as all the other so-called Russian military combatants who are in Crimea and are subject to elimination. Eliminating them in principle is not that difficult, especially in Crimea. Why? Because Crimea itself is a closed space squeezed between two seas, the Azov and the Black Sea. That is, it is practically a ready-made geographic operational cauldron with only two entry and exit routes, from Taman via the Kerch Bridge and through land corridors connecting it to mainland Ukraine. Mainly, if you look at the railway, it's towards Melitopol, you're right, through Henichesk, so those are the routes. That's why it's important for us, when liberating Ukraine, to start by liberating Crimea, because it will be much easier to free Ukrainian territory if we liberate Crimea first. Moreover, it's even easier to liberate Crimea itself. If you compare, for example, the ratio of forces and resources needed to liberate Donbas, you need an order of magnitude fewer forces and resources to liberate Crimea than to liberate Donbas. That's why, without a doubt, Crimea is just asking to be the very first to break free from Russian captivity. There are many mechanisms. How can this be done? Well, first of all, of course, you need to cut off all the bridges that connect Crimea to the Russians. There are several of these bridges. The first bridge is the Kerch Bridge. Moreover, there are several there. A railway bridge, a road bridge, an energy bridge, a fuel bridge, and a water bridge. All of these are the Kerch Bridge. It's the whole Kerch system, the Kerch Bridge system. And it is absolutely necessary to destroy all of them, all 5 of these bridges in this regard. The second bridge, which is next to the Kerch Bridge, is the ferry crossing. The floating docks need to be destroyed. The floating docks, and of course, especially the railroad ferries. The third bridge of this kind, in general, is the so-called sea bridge. That is, these are the same LSTs, large landing ships, which can be used as ferries between ports, for example, on the Russian Black Sea coast and our Crimea. there are still several large landing ships left, and the Russians can use them to transport a significant amount of weaponry with serious tonnage. Then there's the air bridge. Well, the air bridge is a bit simpler. That is, these are planes, these are airfields that can be targeted, and basically the air bridge can be cut off. And the main thing, of course, is the so-called land bridge, the land corridor, which the Russians are now trying to hold at a depth of 80 kilometers. By the way, it's very difficult to do this since it's pressed up against the Azov coast. There are several branches running through there, both highways and railways, railway lines. So, of course, these can be targeted starting from Rostov, Taganrog, then through the Meuse, and then across the Kalmius via the bridges. But realistically, for us, it's very close, about 80 to 100 kilometers to Melitopol and to the crossings, both types, meaning the northern crossings. And basically, that's probably what we'll do. That's why these strikes, which happened simultaneously both on the Kerch Bridge and on the bridge near Melitopol, were precisely on the railway junctions. This is exactly that kind of operation. First, you cut off the supply systems, and then you hit them with long-range strike assets, which everyone understands perfectly. If we manage to gather nearly 1,000 drones for Moscow, then we can definitely find 500 drones for Crimea at least once a week. The main thing now is to retarget specifically to this component, and the milestone for the liberation of Crimea is the third strike on the Kerch Bridge. You could say that the liberation of Crimea will begin with this strike. First, with long-range strike assets, they will dismantle Crimea molecule by molecule over the course of, half a year or even a year. Realistically, if you break it down by actions, first, for several months up to a year, drones and missiles need to be used against military targets in Crimea, and only then, starting next spring, or maybe during the summer campaign of 2026, will our troops actually move into Crimea by land. But that's the optimal scenario. Of course, without air support, it's impossible to advance there. That's why I think that by next spring, we'll already have a sufficient number of aviation units to provide support specifically for the ground operation. And of course, we'll keep harassing Crimea in the meantime.
All in all, the summer of 2025 in Crimea promises to be a hot one.
Absolutely. And the Russians really need to remember, we talked about this with you back in 2023, they need to learn how to swim because the Kerch Bridge won't be there. The exits from Crimea will definitely be under control, so the Russians will have to swim freestyle, breaststroke, or dog paddle their way out of Crimea if they don't leave now by car or train, because those options simply won't be available.
Run, Russians, get out of Crimea. Friends, please like this video. Let us know in the comments what you think about our special operations, about the second and third phases of the SBU's special operation, and Roman Grigorievich and I will continue discussing the SBU's web operation. It can be put on par with the elimination of Osama bin Laden, said US Senator Richard Blumenthal. He called the operation itself proof of Ukraine's agility and determination. He said these strikes disprove the false narrative that Ukraine is losing the war and could shift momentum in Washington toward increasing aid to Ukraine. They can strike air bases 4,000 miles from Ukraine. They can strike anywhere. By sheer skill and audacity, these attacks can be ranked alongside the US raid on Osama bin Laden and the Israeli operation with the trains as some of the greatest military achievements of recent years. Roman Grigorievich, please comment.
The Americans weren't shocked because we struck the Russians. The Americans tried this on for themselves, and now they're shocked to realize that their air bases are just as exposed as the Russian ones. They were protected from each other by treaties. That is, there were certain, I think, under New START, certain protections specifically for strategic strike assets provided by these treaties. Moreover, one of the main conditions was that these planes had to be accessible for monitoring by external surveillance systems like satellites. So as a result, both the Russians and the Americans are required to park their planes on sites that the opposing side can see. But we're not adversaries. No one told Malik about this. He hasn't read the New START treaty. Naturally, he went ahead and struck the Russian strategic bombers, taking one issue off the table. And now the Americans are thinking, wait a minute, the same thing could happen at their bases too. When their bases are wide open, nobody's even touched them. Honestly, if the Chinese or the Houthis or the Iranians or the Russians set out to take out the American strategic forces, there's nothing stopping them either. And if the Chinese get serious about it, especially, things could get real. We can see that in this regard, the Chinese are ahead of everyone else in the world. So that's their problem now. They weren't shocked by our so-called audacity. They were stunned by their own vulnerability to these kinds of weapons, like drones, just a simple, cheap drone.
Yes, Roman Grigorievich, today I read a brilliant analysis by a woman on Facebook, a Ukrainian patriot. She wrote that the whole world, which is afraid of escalation, of nuclear escalation, which didn't give us long-range missiles, which didn't give us Taurus and other missiles that could have allowed us to destroy this entire nuclear triad. They are simply shocked and frightened that Ukraine managed to do all this without their help. Isn't that right, Roman Grigorievich?
That's exactly how it is. Credit to the person who saw it this way, someone who is closely involved with military matters. That's exactly how it is. What was important in the last century, in the previous century, is now absolutely irrelevant, just as what was important in the century before last was irrelevant for the last century. No one nowadays remembers the sling or the boomerang. Of course, I don't mean the rocket. No one remembers bows, arrows, or spears anymore. Now, that is in the last century when rockets and airplanes appeared, and now we're already at the next stage. So what was needed in the last century is simply unnecessary now. Strategic bombers are no longer needed, nor, for example, is that same Navy that used to consume trillions of dollars. Just think how much had to be invested in all that, trillions of dollars. And here it turns out, with his decision to destroy Russia's strategic aviation, Malyuk has basically crossed out this almost century-long saga of, to be honest, looting the world's largest military budgets. Trillions of dollars were invested in this, and now they're simply unnecessary. A single Ukrainian security service has basically given the finger to this entire strategic triad, no matter what form it takes. Moreover, even the nuclear component of this strategic triad doesn't scare us for one simple reason. We have nuclear strike capabilities that are much more powerful, stronger, and more problematic for the enemy than theirs. A nuclear warhead, when it explodes, sometimes it's not even clear whether it was a nuclear detonation or just a powerful conventional missile. You can only measure it with a radiometer. The radiance from radionuclides that accompanies a nuclear explosion, if it is an explosion, fades quickly. And believe me, if you scatter spent nuclear fuel rods over Moscow, we've talked about this so many times, Lenin would come back to life. Yes, he'd be more alive than anyone else from the radiation that would fall, say, on Red Square if the Russians used nuclear weapons against Ukraine. They understand this perfectly well. Why have they gone quiet on the nuclear topic now? Because they realized very well that it was no accident they poked a hole in the fourth reactor of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Who knows what might fall out onto Grandpa Lenin? He might even grow a third head and start running around saying, "You're on the right path, comrades." Well, roughly in the direction they'll be pointing.
Roman Grigorievich, to wrap up, let me just ask you the following question. First of all, after the SBU attacks on strategic nuclear aviation, Z channels reported the following information: that in Moscow, Lieutenant General Sergei Kobylash, the commander of the Russian Air Force, accidentally fell out of a window. And now everyone is starting to count how many strategic bombers we have destroyed or eliminated. That is, 41 have been damaged or destroyed. How significant are these losses? Please comment on this as a final point.
Well, if this isn't a PSYOP, and it could very well be a Russian PSYOP, since they sometimes leak this kind of event into the information flow through certain questionable channels. And then, if the opposing side picks it up, for example, they present it as something negative, then they show this Kobylash, yes, and will go on to say that we are not quite the right kind of people in how we handle this. So for now, since there is no confirmation yet, and there really isn't any, we're holding off. Although, strictly speaking, from the standpoint of responsibility, well, Kobylash should have been made to fly. As for who, so to speak, will make him fly, or has made him, or will make him do it, that will depend on the Russian special services. Because if we're talking about responsibility, it was specifically Kobyliash's responsibility to ensure the security of Russia's strategic nuclear triad. So if not now, then later he'll have to fly. How else could it be?
Dear audience, please like this video. Roman Grigorievich and I meet 3 times a week to discuss the most pressing military topics and to celebrate the successes of our Ukrainian special services and the armed forces of Ukraine. We thank them, our deepest respect. The well-known analyst Roman Grigorievich, thank you very much as always. See you again soon this week.
Goodbye.